Well, hello. Today we're going to start our Bible study of Colossians together, starting here at the Community Pavilion. You say, why would we start a Bible study at the Community Pavilion? Well, today, as we delve into this first chapter of Colossians, our ongoing study of Philemon and Colossians, we're going to be thinking about the theme of rescue. The theme of rescue. And this very spot was where a rather important rescue originated on the evening of September 30th, 1962. Just a mile and a half, couple of miles away, over on campus this Sunday evening, there's a growing crowd of unruly white people. Some people say as many as 3,000 of them. They're very angry because the federal government has pushed to integrate the university, to allow the first black student to register at the university. He's a man by the name of James Meredith, and he has been brought to the campus, and all of these people, these rioters, have converged on campus in front of the Lyceum. To protect the Lyceum and the administrative offices of the university, the federal government in Washington has sent some federal marshals and some border patrol officers and some federal corrections officials, just a group of about 200, 300 law enforcement officers. They kind of scrape together, and so they are standing in front of the Lyceum facing the loop, facing the grove. And all of these rioters are out there, and as darkness falls, they're throwing bricks, they're throwing lighted cigarettes, they're cursing, and there are actually some people firing guns, firing rifles at the Lyceum. And these federal officers are standing there, and they are inside the Lyceum. Their commander is on the telephone to the White House in Washington, and he's under strict orders not to let any of his men fire a pistol or fire a gun back at the rioters because they're worried the violence will spiral out of control. So they're holding the rioters away from the Lyceum by firing tear gas canisters out into the crowd. The federal law enforcement officers are wearing gas masks, and so they're firing tear gas out into the loop, out into the crowd, and keeping them back, but just barely. As the night wears on and the riot intensifies, the federal officials are running out of tear gas. And again, the people in Washington, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy and his assistant Nicholas Katzenbach are saying, do not fire guns at the crowd. We don't want to kill anybody. Don't fire your weapons. We can't afford a bloodbath. This whole thing could be the Civil War again if we let it get out of hand. And so they're just about out of tear gas. Meanwhile, the local National Guard unit, young men from Oxford, Lafayette County, surrounding communities, about 60, 65 men, are here because instead of a pavilion, and some of you can remember this used to be what we call the National Guard Armory. It had walls, it was a metal building, and it was where this military unit would meet on the weekends to train and to go through military exercises. So they've been assembled here. They don't have any training in crowd control, they don't have any training in riot suppression, they don't have any equipment for this sort of thing, but they're here waiting, and their commander, who is William Faulkner's nephew, gets a call from Washington, from Nicholas Katzenbach, the Assistant Attorney General, and tells him to put his men in trucks and take them up to the campus, take them to the Lyceum, because the federal officials there are just about to be overwhelmed by the rioters. And so they do that. They rescue the federal officials, and with the rapid arrival of other federalized troops and full-time federal troops, the riot is eventually suppressed that evening. And so as October 1st, 1962 dawns, our city has been literally torn apart. There's broken glass everywhere, there's burning cars, it's quite a scene of devastation. But the riot is put down because the men here, and by and large local men, got in the trucks and drove through the crowd, drove through the burning vehicles, and got to the Lyceum, and their presence there with their weapons relieved the federal officials, and the line held, so to speak. Some of the men were wounded by bricks thrown by the crowd and other things, but they rescued they rescued those federal marshals. So the theme of rescue is what we're going to be talking about today. And from time to time, a lot of us find ourselves in situations, maybe not that life-threatening, but we find ourselves in situations where we need to be rescued. And so we're going to talk about that today.
Well, we continue with that theme of rescue when we turn to this week's lesson text, Colossians chapter 1. And we're going to start back where we ended last week in verse 12. Uh, and it starts in the middle of a sentence. And we talked about the problem of long sentences in Colossians last week. It says, "And giving joyful thanks to the Father, who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." He has rescued us from the dominion of darkness. The idea of rescue, or in some translations it says delivered us, rescue or deliverance, we're unable to save ourselves. We are trapped. We can't get out by ourselves. We need somebody to help us out of the prison that we're in, dominion of darkness. And just like those federal officers that were running out of tear gas and facing 10-1 odds against that angry mob, we really needed some help. And so Paul reminds the Colossians that they have been rescued. We're going to dive into that a little bit deeper in just a minute, but let's think back to last week where we were in Colossians chapter 1. We studied the opening of the letter and Paul's typical greeting of grace and peace, and then the prayer that he had. He said, I thank God when I pray for you. And he talked about the love that they had for other Christians and the faith that they had in the Lord. And then he prayed the things he wanted them to get, a deeper understanding and uh, strength leading to endurance and patience. Paul thought it was really special to be a Christian. And the first question on today's handout, if you print out or look at the PDF that's attached to your email, if you get an email about this class, you'll see that Paul thought it was really special to be a Christian. He reminded the Colossian Christians that the Father had qualified them, and this is verse 12, he had qualified us to share in the inheritance of his holy people in a special place that he calls the kingdom of light. The kingdom of light. And I don't know where you live right now or how your life is going right now, but Paul says if you're a Christian, if you're a baptized believer, then wake up and look around. You are actually in a place called the kingdom of light. He uses a different expression in the very next verse 13, where he says he's rescued us and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves. The kingdom of light, the kingdom of the Son he loves. And, it's quite reminiscent of the Gospels where we read in Matthew about the kingdom of heaven, or in Mark and Luke about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of light. And he contrasts, he said, we were in the dominion of darkness, and he has rescued us and brought us in to the kingdom of the Son he loves. So what's the main difference between this kingdom of light and this dominion of darkness? It kind of sounds like, I said last time, kind of like Star Wars, and the empire, the darkness associated with the empire. When we delve into the idea of the dominion of darkness, uh, we begin to think about all the things that are against God, that are not part of the kingdom of heaven. And we begin to think about the reality of evil. But if you and I wrote a tour guide to the kingdom, to the dominion of darkness, what are some of the major features and sights if you're a tourist in the dominion of darkness? I don't know if you have noticed it or not, but if you go to the Oxford Square Off Square books, there's a section there where they have tour books to all the states of the United States and all the countries of the world. And, the restaurants you should eat at and the ones you should avoid, the places to stay, the things to see, and so forth and so on. Whether you're going to China or Germany or Montana or wherever you're going, it'll give you the inside view on what you should do and how to get there and how much it's going to cost, that sort of thing. So if we were to write a tour guide for the Dominion of Darkness, what would we say? And we would say that first of all, you're going to see a lot of shame and guilt. You're going to see addiction, disease, pandemic, anger, violence, hatred. You're going to see all kinds of dishonesty, of lying and hatred, and all these things are part of the dominion of darkness. You're going to see uh, people being exploited and mistreated. And this is what he's talking about when he's talking about the dominion of darkness. In the kingdom of light, he says you're qualified to share in the inheritance of the holy people. And so that's what the kingdom of light is all about: redemption, forgiveness of sins. It's the antitype, it's the direct opposite of that dominion of darkness. Diving a little bit deeper into this concept of darkness, an example of the use of darkness in the New Testament, in the words of Paul recorded by Luke in Acts 26, he's talking about his conversion. And he's talking about what Jesus said to him when he appeared to him on the Damascus Road. He says, I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. He equates darkness with the power of Satan. He equates darkness with being shackled by sin, being responsible and guilty for all the ways that we've rebelled against God, and no way to get rid of this guilt. It's a debt literally that cannot be paid. And so if we go through the New Testament and look at in the English translation of the New Testament and look for this word darkness, it's astounding how many times it's not talking about the absence of electromagnetic radiation so we can see. It's not talking about, there's been a storm and the electric power's gone off and it's dark and we have to light some candles or get out our flashlight or something, or a phone. The phone has a flashlight on the back of it. That's what we're doing nowadays. Well, you can't see, it's just absence of. No. It's talking about a moral condition. It's talking about a spiritual condition. It's talking about evil. And I've got a link, if you use the PDF version of the handout, I've got a link that you can click on, and it will list the 41 verses in the New Testament where it uses the word darkness in the NIV. And so that's where we see, references to corruption and rebellion and fear and addiction and disease and ignorance. That's where we see this power of Satan manifest as darkness. And so Paul's writing to the Colossians. He says, this is where you came from. You were in the dominion of darkness. Many people, and you probably, if you're a student of the New Testament, have noticed that Colossians and Ephesians have a lot of common material. Maybe not exact same words, but a lot of the same phrases, a lot of the same ideas and themes. And so in Ephesians 6:12, Paul brings this concept of darkness and evil up again. He says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Um, when I played organized sports, wasn't very athletic. I'm still not very athletic. But I tried to play football in high school, and that's been a long time ago, and a really long time ago. And the game was much more primitive then, to tell you the truth. Even at the high school level now, things are so complicated and sophisticated, and the players really have to memorize a tremendous amount of stuff about what they're supposed to do when, and all the different roles on the team, and they have so many coaches. We had like 3 coaches and a couple of volunteers. But even back then, every week the coaches would get video. It was back on the old reels with the film and everything of the coming opponent, and we would have a scouting report. We would actually have an assistant coach who would go and watch that team play, and then on Monday, before the game was going to be on Friday, they would give us a scouting report on our opponent, and they would tell us what the other team was going to try to do, and what they were good at, what they were weak at, and tell us all about the other team, so we would be prepared. And I think as Christians, we don't pay much attention to the scouting report on our opponent that's in the Bible. It's kind of sad that we think about Satan. We tend to think about this cartoon of this guy with horns and a pitchfork and a tail. And Paul didn't look at it that way. But he did believe strongly in the reality of evil. And it wasn't just one evil player, the Satan, that we were against. He saw us, that there was an army arrayed against us. He said, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Paul said evil is real, it is objective, and it is personified by beings, by spiritual forces. We read about demons all through the Gospels. And, I used to not know really what you do with these things about, is this superstition? Is it kind of like if you go to a primitive culture and the people talk about juju or voodoo or, black magic? Is that real? Or is that, witches, witch doctors, all that kind of stuff? What's the story with that? We like a scientific explanation. We say there is a pandemic because this virus, it's mutated, it's a novel virus, it jumped from animals to humans, and now we've got, we know exactly what it is. I think we kind of sell ourselves short here, because the New Testament teaches there really is such a thing objectively as evil. We like to think that there's not that morality is not really there. I think one of the great prominent atheists of our day has said, well, there's no such thing as morality. It's just selfish genes trying to propagate themselves. And so all moral standards can be explained in terms of evolutionary biology. It just gives you some sort of a reproductive advantage to propagate your genes, and that's why this particular moral standard has been proposed. And believe me, that's not what the New Testament teaches. It teaches there is such a thing as good and there is such a thing as evil. It takes a cataclysmic event like a school shooting or like a 9/11 for us to, or a Holocaust, for us to say, yeah, there really is evil. There are some people who have made moral choices that make them evil. There is something out there that is really, really evil, and therefore we need to be rescued. We are held prisoner. I tell you the story of the rescue, the National Guard, Mississippi National Guard in the armory where the pavilion is now, and how they rushed to the campus and people threw bricks at them and wounded some of them. But they made it up to the Lyceum, and they pushed the rioters away from the Lyceum. They and some other Army units, National Guard units that arrived shortly thereafter, pushed the rioters away and saved the day. But I want you to, in your mind's eye, think about a little bit different scenario for the rescue that you and I have experienced from the dominion of darkness. In fact, our situation before Jesus rescued us through his blood, is that we were prisoners of war. Yes, there is a war going on in our world, in our universe, between good and evil, between the forces of God and the forces of Satan. These spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, that's our opponent. And we like to think, well, there's not real evil out there. There's just some systems and structures that need to be dismantled. And if we could do that because of the inherent goodness of man, that everything would be fine. And so what we need to do is to break down these structures and this systemic racism or whatever it is, and then everything's going to be fine. And that's not the Bible viewpoint. Sure, there may be some things that are systemic that we need to get rid of. Abortion is one on my list, but you know, that's not going to solve the problem if we don't deal with the evil in our own hearts. And that's what's keeping us as prisoners of war. If you look for history for rescues of prisoners of war, it's a pretty short list. It's really hard in a war, an ongoing war, for one country to go in and rescue their soldiers who are being held, have been captured, or being held prisoner behind enemy lines. There are a lot of reasons for that. A couple of examples that are from American history. There were some American prisoners in the Vietnamese War at a camp called Son Tay, just outside of Hanoi, about 20, 30 miles outside of Hanoi. And so the American military organized a very daring rescue operation where they went in, I mean, just right there near Hanoi, the enemy's capital, to free this group of prisoners that were being held at this prison camp. Unfortunately, when they got there, the prisoners had all been moved, and there were no American prisoners there. So, as we say sometimes, the operation was a success, but the patient died. They didn't free any prisoners. In the Civil War, American Civil War, you may know that there was a horrible prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia. And the Confederate forces, when they captured Union soldiers, sent many of them, not all of them, but many of them were sent to Andersonville. And so there were, I don't know, maybe 14,000 federal troops being held prisoner, literally being starved to death. It was basically a huge stockade, a huge fenced-in area, and no shelter, no medical care. Food was very scarce. And so in his operations in Georgia, the Federal General Sherman, who was in Oxford briefly in 1862, by the way, but he was there at the time, and so he sent a cavalry, horse-mounted soldiers, cavalry down towards Andersonville, and he said, if you can get down there far enough, free those prisoners, open up that prison camp and let them free. Unfortunately, that operation was not a success. It was led by a General Stoneman, who is name-checked in the famous song, "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down." But anyway, Stoneman and all of his cavalry were captured. They became prisoners also. It's really hard to do a rescue behind enemy lines. Lastly, a success in World War II, there were a group of several hundred, about 500 American prisoners being held captive by the Japanese in the Philippines. And in January 1945, American forces launched a very daring raid and freed these prisoners. And there's a movie came out in 2005 called The Great Raid about this operation. But they were entirely successful. But it's hard to do. It's a prison camp over here. And so that's the situation that we have. We are in a state of war, and we have been captured by the enemy, the dominion of darkness, and we are in a prison camp over there. And it says that he has rescued us and transferred us into the kingdom of light. The kingdom of light. Now, this is important on several fronts. First of all, I didn't do it myself. I was held prisoner, and I could not get out. The Japanese, the operation I told you about last, they grouped the prisoners in groups of 10. They said if any one of these 10 guys escapes, the other 9 will be immediately executed. That kind of put kind of a damper on, escape plans. They were really held captive. They just could not get away. They were deep in the jungle anyway. It was hard for them to figure out exactly where they would go if they escaped. And so we're similarly held down, and but we get rescued, and we get taken back to the kingdom of the Son He loves. You say, well, if I have been rescued and I'm no longer in the dominion of darkness, and I've been placed back in the kingdom of light, the kingdom of the Son He loves, then why do I have all these problems? Why did my marriage turn out this way? Why did my kids turn out this way? Why am I besieged with death and disease? And or why do I struggle with an addiction? What if all this has happened, then hasn't the victory been won? What's going on? And I'm not sure I can really answer that question for you. I struggle with that question in my own life, but here's a part of the metaphor we should think about. We are prisoners of war who have been rescued and taken back into the kingdom of light, but they didn't take us back home where they could have a parade. Instead, they brought us back to the front lines, okay? And they gave us our weapons back, our rifles or our swords or whatever our weapons are. And we are back involved in the battle. The war is not over. We have been freed to fight. We've been freed to fight, not freed to have medals pinned on our chest and have all the ice cream we can eat and go to the Super Bowl. Instead, we've been freed to fight. And so that's why we find ourselves still confronted with a struggle against evil, even though we have been past tense, rescued and transferred. One more, I know I'm beating this verse to death. It's so great though. I want to say one more thing that is kind of wonky, and a lot of you won't know what I'm talking about. That's fine. This is so great. Some translations, instead of saying He has transferred us to the kingdom of the Son He loves, or this NIV says brought us into the kingdom of the Son He loves, they use the word translated there, translated. And I think that's beautiful. Some of you know several languages, and you know what's involved in translating a thought, translating a sentence in English to Mandarin or Swahili or whatever language you speak, German, French, however it is. And so that's powerful because the thought's the same, but there is a complete change in the sound when we translate from one language to another. The one I really love, though, and what's a little wonky, is in math we learn about something called translation of coordinates. And you can have an equation that in one coordinate system produces a straight line, and in another coordinate system, the same type of equation looks exactly the same, produces a circle. That translation of coordinate systems changes everything. It changes everything. It's a very powerful tool in math to maybe simplify an algebraic expression or to tackle a hard problem of some sort of geometry in space, to translate the coordinates. But what a change in the way things sound or the way things look to be translated into the kingdom of the Son He loves. Well, now we come to a key section of the book of Colossians, and it's on your second page of your sheet, and that is verses 15 through 20. I'll just read it here. Excuse me. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. And He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This section, 15 through 19, is so poetic and so unique in Paul's writings that a lot of scholars think that this is a hymn or a poem that Paul adapted from someplace else and inserted right here because it says just what he wanted to say. Or maybe he composed the poem or the hymn, but it contains some linguistics that I think are a little bit unique in Paul's writings. At any rate, when we translate it into English, it is quite poetic and it is quite powerful, a statement of real praise about Jesus Christ. Well, theologically, it's both simple and deep. And we're going to turn back to this in our future lessons, a little bit more next week and then a little bit less in future lessons. But I say it's both simple and deep. To say the Son is the image of the invisible God, if you have a basic understanding of Christianity, of this concept we call incarnation, how God came in human form as Jesus Christ, this statement that the Son is the image of the invisible God, also Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, John, I think about chapter 14, Jesus' disciple Philip says, show us the Father, and that will be enough. And Jesus says, have I been with you so long, Philip, and you do not know me? Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. Another place in John, he says, the Father is in me, and I am in the Father. So the Son is the image of the invisible God. That's kind of a basic principle. Why does Paul feel compelled to restate these basics with these Colossians who've been Christians for a while? They may be young Christians, and they may be tempted with elements from their environment, from their past. We call this syncretism, where you take a little bit of Judaism, a little bit of mystery religions, a little bit of traditional Greek Roman religion, and a little bit of Christianity. You put them all in a blender, stir them up for about 30 seconds, pour it in a glass and drink it. That's syncretism. And so if you do that, you've got to dilute Jesus. And so in Colossians, Paul keeps pointing back to Jesus, and not only is Jesus number one on the list, he's the list. He's the whole list. How does that apply to us today? Because I think most people who are Christians, at least on an intellectual level, would say, yeah, I get that, Jesus is God incarnate, he's God. So what? I learned that when I was 5 years old or something. It's, so what? I think Satan has had a temptation that he keeps dusting out and brings out, again and again and again in our lives. And that is, he wants to tempt us with an opportunity to improve on Eden. To improve on Eden. He shows up, Eve's a little lonely, nobody to drink coffee with. Adam's off, on a business trip. And this snake, he says to her, you got things nice here, and this is okay, but it could be so much better. It could be so much better. It could be so much better. He says, if we could just do things a little differently, then you could get a much better experience. A much better experience. It's all about your experience. Well, we're going to dive into this concept of improving on Eden more as we move into the book of Colossians, but let's wind things up here by kind of outlining this hymn, this prayer, verses 15 through 19. And this is the question on your sheet. It notes three main roles that the Son, that Jesus has. And first of all, we find that he is the agent of creation. He is the creator. And this harkens back to John chapter 1 that says everything was made through him. Verse 16, for in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. You know, we're just learning that in the universe we thought everything was matter and energy, but it turns out that there's a whole lot of matter and energy that we hadn't accounted for. We don't know really what this stuff is, so we call it dark matter and dark energy. And you know, we thought we had it figured out, and now we find out that most of it we didn't even count on. We didn't even know it was there. Visible and invisible. There's a great invisible reality. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and in him and for him. So, first of all, the role of the Son as creator. And then the second role that he has to play is the head of the church. He is the head of the body, the church. The head of the body, the church. So, right in the middle of this hymn, we find Christ's role in the church. And it's interesting to me how the church and the life of the church has been continuously de-emphasized in Christianity in my lifetime. And I'll dust that soapbox off a little bit later on. We can get into that a little bit. But here, it's really part of who Jesus is. And then finally, and this gets us back to that rescue theme, he is the agent of reconciliation, verse 20. And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. To reconcile to himself all things. There is in the Bible the concept that man's fall in the book of Genesis, man's rebellion against God, man's sin, not only warped Adam and his life with Eve and their relationship with God, but it had an impact on the physical universe as well. And in Romans chapter 8, we read that the whole creation is groaning right now. He says it's groaning like it's in childbirth. You know, back then, they didn't have anesthesia. They didn't have epidurals. You know, there was some screaming and hollering going on when people gave birth. And so he says it's groaning. The creation is trying to get to that next stage where it will be fully redeemed. And so we see earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis and pandemics around us today as this broken and fallen world groans for its redemption. And that's the role of the Son as a reconciler and a redeemer because of his blood shed on the cross, is what it says here. So that brings us to conclusion. We're going to look at that hymn just a little bit more next week and continue to march on into the end of chapter 1 and introduce the beginning of chapter 2. The first two chapters are the hard part because they deal with in-depth theological questions, but they build a foundation for practical advice about our daily lives in chapters 3 and 4. So continue to read and study this book of Colossians. Continue to pray for me, and as I pray for you, and I look forward to being with you at worship at the Oxford Church of Christ if you can make it at 10 o'clock tomorrow. So God bless you today. Bye.